Imagine you're standing in the middle of Times Square. It's the 1950s. Cars are everywhere, neon signs light up the streets, people are leaving theaters and stores and walking along the sidewalks. But suddenly, a man appears who doesn't seem to belong there at all. He's wearing clothing that looks like it came from another century. He looks completely confused. Cars, the lights, the buildings, it's almost as if he's seen it all for the first time. And then he steps into the street and he's struck by a car and instantly killed. But when police supposedly search the man's body, the story becomes much stranger. They find old money, old business cards, a receipt connected to a hearse stable that's not even there anymore, and a letter dated 1876. So who was this man? And why was he apparently carrying possessions from more than 70 to 100 years earlier? His name was supposedly Rudolph Fentz. And according to one version of the story, this man didn't belong in 1950 at all. He supposedly came from 1876. And if that sounds impossible, just wait. Because the deeper you investigate the story of Rudolph Fentz, the stranger it gets. Trust me. What's going on, everybody? Welcome back to the X-Files. Today we're looking into one of the strangest supposed time travel cases ever told. The story of a mysterious man who allegedly appeared in Times Square, carrying possessions that seemed to belong to another century. But we're going to look at both sides of this because there are reasons this story has become so convincing over time. But there's also evidence that could completely change and think about how you look at it. So was Rudolph Fentz actually a man out of time? Or are we looking at an urban legend that became so convincing that people eventually forgot where it even came from? Let's get into it. According to the commonly told version of this story, a mysterious man suddenly appeared in Times Square. He was reportedly around 30 years old, but immediately something about him seemed very wrong. His clothing looked completely out of place. Not out of style by a few years, but by decades. People were staring at him immediately as they seen him. He supposedly looked like someone who had stepped directly out of the late 1800s. Witnesses supposedly described him as confused and instantly frightened. Imagine what Times Square would look like to somebody who had never seen a modern automobile. Electric signs, towering buildings, or thousands of people moving through a modern city. And according to the story, before Fentz could understand what was happening, he stepped into the street and was struck and killed by a car coming around the corner at high speeds. But his death wasn't what created the legend. It was what investigators supposedly found on his body afterwards. Police supposedly searched his pockets, and according to the story, they discovered several strange objects. Old-fashioned currency, business cards bearing the name Rudolph Fentz, a token, a receipt connected to a horse stable, and corresponds supposedly dating back to 1876. If these objects were really found exactly as the story describes, there was an obvious question. Who was Rudolph Fentz? And that's where the story goes from strange to almost unbelievable. According to the legend, investigators couldn't initially find Rudolph Fentz in the contemporary records, but eventually, their search supposedly led them into the past. And that's when they allegedly discovered another man named Rudolph Fentz, spelled the exact same way. According to the story, this Rudolph Fentz disappeared in 1876. He supposedly left his home one evening and never came back. His family had searched for him for years, but he was never found until supposedly more than 70 years later. Descriptions of the missing man allegedly matched the mysterious man who appeared in Times Square. And suddenly, those strange possessions began to make sense to the police. The old money, the horse's stable receipt, the clothing, the letter dated 1876, which was one of the most crucial pieces of evidence they had. And that's where the time travel theory comes from. Because according to this interpretation, Rudolph Fentz didn't live through those missing decades. He didn't secretly build another life. He didn't grow old. He disappeared from 1876 and somehow appeared decades into the future, possibly without experiencing the missing time at all. Before we dismiss this story, there's a reason Rudolph Fentz became such a famous supposed time traveler. This isn't simply a story saying some guy traveled through time. We're given a name, a location, and dates. Objects supposedly recovered from his body, and even an investigation supposedly connecting him to someone who disappeared decades earlier. The more specific a story becomes, the more authentic it can feel. Then you have the possessions. If someone really appeared carrying objects that could generally be traced back to 1876, that would obviously raise some serious questions. But there's an important distinction. Old objects aren't proof of time travel. To establish something extraordinary, we need actual objects, documentation, and independent verification. And then there's probably the strongest part of the entire legend, the supposed disappearance in 1876. If historical records generally showed that a 29-year-old Rudolph Fentz disappeared in 1876, and independent police records showed that the same person appeared decades later, that would be pretty difficult to explain, especially when you consider that he had his name on the business cards with the letter dated from the exact time that he had went missing all those years before. So, can we actually find those records? Now, this is where we have to separate the story from the evidence. We know the Rudolph Fentz story exists across multiple generations. We know it has been repeated as a supposed genuine time travel mystery. But what about the actual incident? Where's the original police report? Where are the photographs? Where are those possessions? And most importantly, can we independently verify that Rudolph Fentz disappeared in 1876? Because when researchers begin looking for the origin of this story, they found something that completely changes the case. In 1951, science fiction author Jack Finney published a short story called I'm Scared, Jack Finney, Collier's September 15th, 1951. And inside that story is Rudolph Fentz. Yes, the same name, the mysterious man, Times Square, the old possessions, and the apparent connection to 1876. So now we have a major problem because we have a documented work of fiction containing the central elements of the supposedly real Rudolph Fentz case. So the question changes. Did Jack Finney create Rudolph Fentz? Could Finney have been inspired by an earlier account? Or did this fictional story become separated from its original source and eventually get repeated as a fact? This might actually be the most fascinating part of the entire mystery. Over time, versions of Rudolph Fentz's story became circulating as though they described an actual historical event. Someone tells the story, someone else repeats it, another version adds a little bit of more details, and eventually the original source becomes separated from the entire story. Suddenly, something that began as just a regular story on a page in a magazine can sound like history. And that's apparently what happened with Rudolph Fentz. Now, before you start to think, okay, so this whole story was made up and just retold a million times and eventually became a legend, I wouldn't quite say that just yet. Yeah, finding a fictional version of the story is powerful evidence, but someone who believes there could still be something more to it might ask, could Finney have just been inspired by an earlier version of the story that he was told? Could a real unidentified person case have become mixed with the fiction? Could records have just disappeared over time? Those are fair questions to investigate. And if authentic documentation predating Finney's story were ever discovered, that would make this case considerably more interesting. Now, let's consider the other explanation. What if Rudolph Fentz never existed? What if no one ever traveled through time? What if this mystery actually demonstrates something completely different? How fiction can become folklore. We have a documented fictional source. We don't have authentical physical evidence demonstrating that Rudolph Fentz traveled through time. And the Fentz story was repeated as an urban legend. That makes the fictional origin explanation considerably stronger. But that doesn't make the story boring, because thousands of people eventually encountered Rudolph Fentz, not as a fictional character, but as supposedly a real man. And that leads me to this point. Because before I close the case on Rudolph Fentz, there's another side of the story that I don't think we should ignore. Because it's easy for us to sit here today, find Jack Finney's story, and say, well, there it is, mystery solved. This has been just one big urban legend. But what if there's another piece of evidence that makes you realize that could very well not be the case? So for years, Rudolph Fentz wasn't always discussed as some fictional character. He was discussed as an actual case. Writers repeated it, paranormal researchers investigated it, and some researchers actually pointed to Rudolph Fentz as possible evidence of time travel. And think about that for a second. These weren't necessarily people sitting around discussing their favorite science fiction character. Some of them apparently believed and dedicated years of their life to proving Rudolph Fentz was a real man. Researchers looking into the history of the story later found that the Fentz case had been repeated through paranormal literature for decades, with some researchers accepting the account and using it as evidence of time travel. And this is where things get interesting again. Remember what we just talked about, how Jack Finney's story was published in September of 1951? Well, years later, another claim began circulating. A researcher associated with a Berlin newspaper archive supposedly discovered something. An older newspaper article. And according to the claim, that newspaper article told the Rudolph Fentz story in April of 1951. That's months before Finney's story was published. And and I want to emphasize if, that newspaper article could ever be authenticated, we'd suddenly have a very different mystery altogether. Because then we would have to ask, did Rudolph Fentz actually originate with Jack Finney? Or did Finney hear about an already existing story and then turn it into fiction? And that would completely reverse the question. Did fiction create the legend? Or did the legend inspire the fiction? Then go back to what supposedly happened. A man appears wearing clothing from another century. He's completely disoriented by the world around him. He's carrying old currency, old business cards, a horse stable receipt, a letter dated 1876, and investigators supposedly connected his identity to a man who disappeared decades earlier. And throughout time, they had just lost the evidence to prove that this really happened. If even a portion of that could someday be independently verified, this just stops being another urban legend. It becomes something much harder to explain. And there's something else I've been thinking about. If someone accidentally traveled from 1800s to the 1950s, what would we expect them to look like? They probably wouldn't arrive with some futuristic machine. They wouldn't understand what is happening around them. They wouldn't know where they were. They'd probably be terrified, confused, overwhelmed by cars, lights, and noise, and a city completely different from the one they remember. In other words, they might look a lot like the man described in the Rudolph Fentz story. Of course, we still have a major problem. We don't have the original police evidence. We don't have Rudolph's body. We don't have those possessions. And we don't have an authenticated 1876 missing person record to establish the story. So I'm not saying this proves Rudolph Fentz traveled through time. It doesn't. But I also think there's a difference between we haven't proven this happened and we've proven this couldn't have happened. And those aren't the same thing. So maybe Rudolph Fentz was simply Jack Finney's creation. Maybe decades of paranormal writers unknowingly turned fiction into history. That explanation has strong evidence behind it. But if someone ever authenticates a version of Rudolph Fentz's story that existed before Finney's, or discovered an independent record from 1876, or even finds documentation of the supposed Times Square incident, then we would have to reopen this entire case, and most likely it could even be overturned. Because maybe, just maybe, the reason the Rudolph Fentz story survived for so long isn't simply because it's a great story. Maybe there's still a piece of this puzzle that we haven't found yet. And that's why I'm not ready to simply tell you what to believe. Because now you've heard the case against Rudolph Fentz, and you've heard the case for him. So let's put everything side by side and see what we can actually establish. So let's look at what we can and can't establish. The Rudolph Fentz story does exist. Jack Finney wrote a fictional story involving Rudolph Fentz titled I'm Scared, and it was published in 1951. The story involves a man apparently displaced through time, and Rudolph Fentz later became widely discussed as a supposedly genuine mystery. What we cannot establish is that Rudolph Fentz actually appeared in Times Square in 1950, that he really disappeared in 1876, that the legendary police investigation occurred exactly as described, and that the objects supposedly recovered from him existed as described, that a human being traveled from 1876 to 1950. Those are the things that we can't establish, mostly because the evidence has been misplaced or wasn't documented. And that's the difference between saying this absolutely didn't happen and saying we currently don't have the evidence demonstrating that it did. And I think that's an important difference between them. So, was Rudolph Fentz really a time traveler? Based on the evidence currently available, the fictional explanation is much better supported. But like I said, still, imagine for a second that tomorrow someone discovered an authentic NYPD report from 1950 or an 1876 missing person record naming Rudolph Fentz. So, was Rudolph Fentz really a time traveler? Uh, Based on the evidence currently available, the fictional explanation is much better supported. But like I said, imagine just for a second that tomorrow someone discovered authentic NYPD report from 1950 describing the incident, or an 1876 missing person record naming Rudolph Fentz. That would immediately make this story much more interesting and reopen the case altogether. But until evidence like that appears, we can't treat the time travel explanation as established history. And strangely enough, that doesn't make Rudolph Fentz any less fascinating. Because instead of a mystery about time travel, we may have a mystery about how stories travel. So, what do I personally believe? Well, when you look back at the 1950s era, especially in police reporting, a lot of things weren't as detailed and kept classified as they are today. So I could easily see how maybe some of this stuff or evidence that Rudolph had on him got mishandled and just disappeared. And when you look at how time travel could apparently happen, they always say it's much easier to go forward in time than go back. But when I look at evidence being neutral, can't disagree that there is a lot more evidence saying that this could just be an urban legend versus being real. So maybe Rudolph Fentz never traveled through time. Maybe he never stood beneath the lights in Times Square. Maybe he never saw automobiles for the first time. And maybe there was never a mystery man carrying possessions from 1876. But when I think about it, somewhere along the way, a fictional character escaped the pages of a story and became real in the minds of thousands of people. And maybe that's the strangest part of the Rudolph Fentz mystery. I've shown you what we can establish, and I've shown you what's missing. And now, I'll leave the final decision up to you. Do you think Rudolph Fentz was nothing more than an urban legend? Or do you think there's something about this story that we still haven't discovered? Let me know what you think. And if you enjoyed going down this rabbit hole with me, subscribe because we've got plenty more mysteries to investigate. Thanks for watching. And remember, every mystery is sometimes better left unsolved.